April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above Caen, France. The oxygen mask couldn't conceal Oberleutnant Ralph Hermakin's faint smirk as he observed the unfamiliar silhouette slowly climbing toward his formation through the crystal-clear canopy of his Focke-Wulf 198.5. The 26-year-old veteran ace of Jagdgeschwader studied the American fighters making their first combat appearance over occupied Europe. "They've sent us flying milk bottles," he radioed to his wingman, barely holding back a laugh at the sight of the massive Republic P-47 Thunderbolts struggling to gain altitude. Below them, 16 P-47C Thunderbolts of the 4th Fighter Group pushed upward in tight formation, their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2 800 double Wasp engines straining against their 7-ton weight. To German pilots accustomed to sleek Spitfires and agile Soviet fighters, these bulky American machines looked almost ridiculous. Barrel-shaped fuselages crowned with greenhouse canopies, wings that seemed undersized for their heavy bodies, and propellers larger than anything in the Luftwaffe's inventory. What Hermakin didn't realize, what none of the German pilots circling above like predators could have foreseen, was that they were witnessing the arrival of a weapon that would gradually dismantle the Luftwaffe's fighter force. Within 18 months, these flying milk bottles would evolve from objects of ridicule into instruments of fear, their 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns becoming one of the most dreaded sounds in the German skies. The destructive potential was already built into those broad wings. 3,400 rounds of ammunition and a combined firing rate of 6,000 rounds per minute. Enough concentrated firepower to tear a Messerschmitt apart in under 2 seconds. The turning point began that April morning when Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation preparing to attack. A former Eagle Squadron pilot who had transitioned from RAF Spitfires only weeks earlier, he understood something his men had yet to grasp. That survival in the P-47 required abandoning traditional air combat tactics. The Thunderbolt marked a dramatic shift in fighter design philosophy. While German engineers focused on lightweight interceptors optimized for climb and maneuverability, Republic Aviation had created something entirely new. A high-altitude powerhouse that relied on mass, engine strength, and overwhelming firepower to redefine aerial warfare. Among the 56 American pilots scattered across the French sky that morning were men destined to become legends. Future aces whose names would soon echo with fear in Luftwaffe ranks. But on April 8, 1943, they were complete novices in an unproven aircraft, facing what was arguably the most experienced fighter force in the world. German pilots had been in continuous combat since 1939, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The Americans, by contrast, had exactly 0 days of combat experience. This is the story of how industrial logic overcame tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality combined into overwhelming superiority, and how German pilots' laughter turned into fear once they discovered what synchronized Browning machine guns could do to an aircraft at 400 yards. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt was born out of urgency in June 1940. As German forces swept across France, Alexander Kartveli, Republic Aviation's Georgian-born chief designer, received an urgent request from the U.S. Army Air Corps. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching the Luftwaffe's best. What Kartveli created instead was something entirely different, a massive aircraft that pushed the limits of fighter design. It will be a dinosaur, he admitted to his team, but a dinosaur with good proportions. When the P-47B prototype first flew on May 6, 1941, it surprised everyone who saw it. Weighing 9,900 pounds empty, it was 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. Its enormous turbo-supercharger system, with ducting running through the rear fuselage, gave it a bulky, almost oversized appearance. Test pilots approaching it for the first time often asked the same question: this thing actually flies. Not only did it fly, it performed unlike anything else at high altitude. The Pratt & Whitney R2 800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower, could maintain full power at 27,000 feet, where many German fighters began to struggle. The turbo supercharger, powered by exhaust gases, allowed it to deliver near sea-level performance even in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group training in Bridgeport, Connecticut, initially disliked the aircraft. Between September 1942 and January 1943, his unit lost 18 pilots and 41 aircraft in training accidents. In fact, the P-47 claimed more American lives in training than German forces did in its early months of combat. It was difficult to handle, prone to ground loops on landing, torque roll on takeoff, and dangerous high-speed dives where compressibility caused the controls to stiffen as shock waves formed on the wings. Yet those who mastered it found something remarkable. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, A farm boy from Oklahoma who would go on to become one of America's leading aces with 27 victories described his first experience. It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive. The power was incredible. You didn't really fly it. You pointed it. The first combat encounters in April and May 1943 seemed to confirm German assumptions. The P-47 could not outturn the Focke-Wulf 190, could not outclimb the Messerschmitt Bf 109, and lacked the agility of these fighters at medium altitudes. Luftwaffe pilots quickly adapted, exploiting these weaknesses by attacking from below, where the heavy Thunderbolt struggled, and forcing turning engagements where maneuverability mattered more than firepower. Joseph Pips Priller, commander of Jagdgeschwader 26, reported after his initial encounter, "The new American fighter is easy prey. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." American pilots began calling them Indiana. Big, fat targets pretending to be warriors. Early statistics seemed to support the German view. In their first month of operations, U.S. fighter groups lost 14 Thunderbolts while claiming only 3 confirmed German kills. RAF pilots, watching from their Spitfire squadrons, quietly hinted that the Americans might want to rethink their choice of aircraft. Some British flyers joked that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around inside its spacious cockpit. Yet something unusual was happening in those early encounters, something German intelligence largely overlooked. The P-47s that were shot down had endured extraordinary damage before going down. One aircraft returned from a mission on May 4th riddled with 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes. Damage that would have destroyed a Messerschmitt or Spitfire outright. Its massive radial engine, lacking vulnerable liquid cooling systems, could absorb hits that would have disabled other fighters instantly. Even more important was what happened when P-47s managed to bring their guns to bear. The Thunderbolt's armament created a devastating zone of firepower unlike anything German pilots had faced. While earlier fighters relied on rifle-caliber weapons or cannons with limited ammunition, the P-47 could deliver sustained fire for over 30 seconds. An eternity in aerial combat. The turning point in German perception began on June 26, 1943, over Lazo, France. It involved Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 61st Fighter Squadron in an encounter that would become legendary on both sides. Johnson's formation of 48 P-47s was returning from an escort mission when they were ambushed by 16 Focke-Wulf 190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, led by Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland, the younger brother of the well-known Adolf Galland. The German pilots executed a textbook attack, diving out of the sun with a decisive speed advantage. Johnson, flying at the rear of the formation, was caught in a deadly crossfire almost immediately. In seconds, his aircraft suffered massive damage. 20 mm cannon shells tore through it. The canopy shattered, hydraulic fluid sprayed into the cockpit, the engine cowling was ripped away, and flames erupted behind the instrument panel. Wounded in the nose and leg by shrapnel, Johnson attempted to bail out, only to discover the canopy was jammed. A shell had exploded in the track, sealing it shut. He was trapped inside a crippled aircraft at 27,000 feet. What followed challenged everything pilots believed about combat survivability. With no forward visibility through an oil-smeared windscreen, a violently shaking engine, and barely responsive controls, Johnson somehow managed to stabilize the aircraft and turn it toward England. The P-47 kept flying despite damage that would have reduced most fighters to wreckage. And then the situation grew even worse. The combined firepower of the Thunderbolt created what pilots described as an almost impenetrable zone of destruction. Aircraft caught within this convergence didn't simply go down. They were torn apart in midair. The full impact of American firepower became clear during the August 17, 1943 dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg, the deepest Allied penetration into Germany up to that point. The mission revealed both the limitations of the P-47, particularly its restricted range even with drop tanks, and its devastating effectiveness when used correctly. Major David Schilling, leading the 62nd Fighter Squadron, intercepted a formation of Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighters preparing to attack B-17 bombers with their cannons and rockets. These twin-engine aircraft, heavily armed but less agile, were the Luftwaffe's primary bomber destroyers. Schilling's 4 P-47s rolled into a dive from 28,000 feet. Unteroffizier Heinrich Roth, a gunner in one of the Bf 110s who survived, later described the encounter during interrogation. The American fighters came down like hammers from the sky. I opened fire at 800 meters. I saw hits on the wing. The P-47 didn't even shake. Then he fired. The aircraft ahead of us just disintegrated. Not shot down. Destroyed. Wings tore away. The tail separated. The cockpit shattered into fragments. In seconds, it was gone. In less than a minute, multiple German aircraft were obliterated. The concentration of firepower was unlike anything they had faced before. Each P-47 carried 425 rounds per gun, 3,400 rounds in total, amounting to nearly 900 pounds of ammunition. At a typical convergence distance of 300 yards, all 8 machine guns focused their fire into a space barely 6 feet across. Any aircraft caught within that zone faced a storm of nearly 100 projectiles per second, each traveling at roughly 2,900 feet per second. The ammunition itself reflected American industrial strength. While German fighters often carried only 120, 200 rounds for their 20 cannons, the P-47 could sustain fire for over 30 seconds. Its belts combined armor-piercing incendiary, tracer, and standard rounds in sequences designed not only to destroy targets but to ignite them. Lieutenant Colonel Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, later the leading American ace in Europe with 28 victories, described the effect. When all 8 guns hit, the target doesn't just fall, it comes apart. I saw a Bf-109 split in two, the tail going one way, the nose another. The pilot never had a chance. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe began to realize another critical disadvantage. The P-47's performance improved significantly at high altitude, while German fighters lost effectiveness. Its turbo-supercharged engine maintained full power up to 30,000 feet, whereas German aircraft, relying on mechanical superchargers, struggled above 25,000. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's most successful aces with 206 victories, encountered this harsh reality on October 8, 1943. Leading Jagdgeschwader 1 against a B-17 formation at 28,000 feet over Bremen, he found his Focke-Wulf 190A6 sluggish and unresponsive in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine, highly effective at medium altitudes, struggled for oxygen nearly 6 miles above the Earth. When P-47S of the 56th Fighter Group dived on his formation from 32,000 feet, the German fighters were left exposed and vulnerable. Robert Johnson, now a seasoned pilot on his way to becoming an ace, was flying at 31,000 feet when he spotted Hans Philipp's distinctive Focke-Wulf, marked with elaborate nose art. Johnson's combat report was brief and precise. Opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection. Observed hits along entire fuselage. Enemy aircraft exploded. No parachute seen. Philipp's death sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe. If one of their most experienced aces, a pilot with over 500 combat missions on both Eastern and Western fronts, could be brought down so decisively, what hope did less experienced pilots have? The German High Command immediately ordered a detailed analysis of the P-47. The report, delivered to Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring in November 1943, painted a troubling picture. The Thunderbolt's service ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet, higher than any German fighter could reliably reach. Its dive speed approached the limits of compressibility, nearing the sound barrier. Its protection included a 3/8-inch steel plate behind the pilot, a half-inch bulletproof windscreen, and armored shielding around critical engine components. Most alarming of all, its rugged design allowed it to survive damage that would have destroyed multiple conventional fighters, and still return to base. In January 1944, a new version of the aircraft arrived in England, completing its transformation from a target of ridicule into a formidable weapon. The P-47D2 introduced a Hamilton standard hydromatic propeller with 13-foot paddle blades. These wide blades gripped the air far more effectively, dramatically improving performance. Climb rate increased almost immediately. Earlier Thunderbolts struggled to reach 2,200 feet per minute at sea level, but the upgraded versions could climb at around 3,000 feet per minute, matching or even surpassing German fighters in many conditions. Acceleration improved as well, allowing the P-47 to build speed and energy far more quickly in combat. Heinrich Erler of Jagdgeschwader 11, a veteran pilot with more than 200 missions, encountered these improved Thunderbolts in February 1944 during a bomber interception near Hanover. He later wrote in his diary, "The heavy American fighters have learned to climb. We attacked expecting the usual advantage, but they turned toward us and climbed with us." When we tried to break away, they followed us to 30,000 feet. Schmidt was hit and blown apart. Nothing left but smoke and fragments. These are not the same aircraft we mocked last year. The new propeller did more than enhance performance. It changed the very sound of the aircraft. The deep, rolling thunder created by blade tips nearing supersonic speed could be heard from miles away. German ground troops began recognizing the approach of P-47s by that ominous roar alone. A low, threatening rumble that signaled danger from above. They gave it a name, Donnerschlag or Thunderclap. By March 1944, with the addition of external fuel tanks, P-47s were finally able to escort Allied bombers deep into German territory. The standard configuration allowed the Thunderbolt to carry 208-gallon wing tanks or a 75-gallon belly tank, extending its range to more than 1,000 miles. With the new paddle blade propeller maintaining strong performance even under heavy load, P-47s could enter combat on equal terms immediately after dropping their tanks. The Luftwaffe responded by focusing their efforts on the bombers, hoping to inflict enough losses to halt the American daylight bombing campaign. But doing so meant flying directly through the P-47 escort screen, an increasingly dangerous, often suicidal task. German pilots soon developed a reluctant respect that edged into fear of the large American fighters. Major Günther Röhl, one of Germany's leading aces with 275 victories, survived a brutal encounter with P-47s on March 6, 1944, though he was badly wounded. He later recalled, "We saw them above us, large silhouettes against the sun. Someone joked, 'Here come the flying pigs.' No one was laughing half a minute later. They dove like an avalanche, faster than we could react. In the first pass, 3 of our fighters were simply gone, reduced to burning debris. Their guns didn't fire in bursts like ours. They unleashed continuous streams. If you were caught in that fire, you were finished instantly." Escort missions revealed another key advantage of the P-47, endurance. While German fighters often operated at high power settings that quickly drained fuel, the American radial engines allowed efficient cruising even at high altitude. Thunderbolts could remain with bomber formations for extended periods, rotating positions while still retaining enough fuel for combat and the return journey. As more P-51 Mustangs arrived in the spring of 1944 to handle long-range escort duties, P-47 units increasingly shifted toward ground attack operations, a role in which they would become one of the most feared weapons in the European theater. This transition accelerated in April 1944 as Allied forces prepared for the invasion of France. The Thunderbolt's 8 heavy machine guns proved just as effective against ground targets as they were in the air. Armor-piercing incendiary rounds could penetrate the thin top armor of German vehicles, while the sheer volume of fire could destroy unprotected targets in seconds. A 2-second burst could deliver around 160 half-inch projectiles into an area no larger than a truck. The addition of bombs and rockets elevated the P-47 into a true multi-role powerhouse. The D-25 variant could carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings and a 500-pound bomb under the fuselage, matching the payload of early war medium bombers. Later versions added rocket launchers for up to 10 5-inch high-velocity rockets, each with destructive power comparable to a 105 mm artillery shell. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment during the Normandy campaign, experienced these attacks firsthand. He later described them. They came in low, so low you could see the pilots' faces. The noise was terrifying, engines roaring, rockets screaming, then the hammering of those heavy machine guns. A column of our trucks simply vanished. 20 vehicles turned into burning wreckage in a single pass. The psychological impact on the men was enormous. They called them Jabos, fighter bombers. But these were something more. They were like flying artillery with sniper precision. On June 6, 1944, the Luftwaffe fully realized how dramatically the balance of power had shifted. More than 500 P-47s provided air cover for the Allied invasion, forming a protective shield over the beaches. German fighters attempting to reach the landing zones were cut down in large numbers. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader II, one of only 3 German pilots to reach the beaches that day, later reported, "The sky belonged entirely to the Americans. Thunderbolts filled it from sea level to 30,000 feet. We tried to break through at dawn. 12 fighters from our group. I was the only one who came back. The P-47s were positioned at every altitude. There was no way around them. You couldn't climb above or dive below. Their guns turned attacking fighters into fragments of falling metal. In the weeks after D-Day, Thunderbolts methodically destroyed German movement in daylight. The numbers were staggering. In June alone, 9th Air Force P-47s claimed the destruction of 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, and 4,553 horse-drawn vehicles. The Wehrmacht was forced to shift nearly all movement to nighttime, severely limiting its ability to respond to Allied advances. The Germans attempted every countermeasure they could devise. They reinforced vehicle armor, increased anti-aircraft defenses, and improved camouflage. None of it proved effective. The P-47's combination of speed, durability, and overwhelming firepower made it extremely difficult to stop. Even the feared 88mm anti-aircraft guns struggled to track the fast-moving fighters at low altitude. While wreaking havoc in Europe, the Thunderbolt was also proving its value in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, operating from New Guinea, found that the aircraft's range, toughness, and firepower were perfectly suited to the vast distances and harsh conditions of that theater. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th, developed new tactics tailored to the Pacific War. On October 11, 1943, he led 4 P-47s against a force of 40 Japanese aircraft over Wewak, personally shooting down 6 in a single mission, an action that earned him the Medal of Honor. Japanese pilots, used to engaging lighter and more fragile American fighters, were unprepared for the Thunderbolt's resilience. Ace Saburo Sakai later wrote, "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannon, which could destroy a P-40 with a few hits, seemed ineffective. I fired dozens of rounds into one Thunderbolt and watched it continue flying. Their return fire was terrifying, streams of heavy bullets that tore aircraft apart." The P-47N, developed specifically for Pacific operations, featured increased fuel capacity with wet wings, holding 93 gallons each, extending its range to 2,350 miles. This variant would go on to escort B-29 bombers to Japan, proving that what had once been a short-range fighter had evolved into a true long-range weapon. Perhaps the ultimate validation of the P-47's evolution came in its encounters with German jet aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 262, with a top speed of 540 miles per hour, should have been beyond the reach of propeller-driven fighters. Yet Thunderbolt pilots found ways to engage them, primarily during takeoff and landing, when jets were most vulnerable, and during high-speed dives from altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer of the 352nd Fighter Group became one of the first pilots to shoot down a Me 262 and a P-47. Diving from 28,000 feet, his Thunderbolt accelerated to nearly 500 miles per hour, fast enough to intercept the jet. The German pilot, relying on his speed advantage, never saw the attack coming. Meyer later reported, "The enemy aircraft broke apart under fire. Large sections, including both engines, separated from the fuselage. The pilot did not escape." The concentrated fire of the 50 caliber guns proved more effective than expected against jet aircraft. By early 1945, specialized P-47M variants were introduced to counter German jets and V-1 flying bombs. Equipped with water methanol injection boosting engine output to 2,800 horsepower and refined aerodynamics, these late-model Thunderbolts could reach speeds of 470 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, fast enough to challenge even jet aircraft under certain conditions. Major George Bostwick, commanding the 63rd Fighter Squadron, scored 2 victories against Me 262s in March 1945. His tactical report emphasized a key lesson. In the end, it was not speed alone, but firepower and positioning that determined the outcome. "The jets are faster," one pilot noted, "but they can't turn, and they can't absorb damage. One solid burst from our guns and they come apart like paper. They have to slow down to attack bombers. That's when we strike." The clearest demonstration of American industrial power came during Operation Bodenplatte, Germany's final large-scale attempt to cripple Allied air forces on January 1, 1945. Nearly 900 German aircraft, including many of their most experienced remaining pilots, launched surprise attacks on Allied airfields across Belgium and the Netherlands. At Y-34 Airfield near Metz, home to the 365th Fighter Group's P-47s, the attack initially achieved success. German fighters destroyed 22 Thunderbolts on the ground, along with several other aircraft. A captured German pilot brought before the command post gestured toward the burning planes and mocked. "What do you think of that?" Major George Bostwick responded calmly, pointing toward the flight line where ground crews were already clearing wreckage and preparing for replacements. "By tomorrow, we'll have 40 new ones. How long will it take you to replace your pilots?" The German pilot's confidence vanished. Within 48 hours, brand new P-47 D-40s had filled the airfield, flown in from depots across England. The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, lost 271 aircraft and 213 pilots during the operation, many of them highly trained leaders and instructors they could not replace. Allied losses totaled 134 aircraft across all attacked bases, all of which were replaced within days. The numbers told the larger story. Republic Aviation produced 15,683 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war, more than any other American fighter. At peak output, its Farmingdale, Long Island factory completed one aircraft every hour around the clock. A second plant in Evansville, Indiana, built on farmland in 1942, was producing up to 500 aircraft per month by 1944. Each P-47 required roughly 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. Its engine alone contained over 2,400 precision components. Yet American workers, many of them new to aviation, assembled these machines with remarkable consistency and quality. Ammunition production matched this scale. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and with hundreds of sorties flown daily, consumption exceeded 10 million rounds per month by mid-1944. Facilities like Lake City Army Ammunition Plant produced up to 30 million rounds monthly, each manufactured with extreme precision to ensure reliability. Fuel demands were equally immense. A single Thunderbolt consumed about 100 gallons per hour in normal flight and up to 300 gallons in combat. By late 1944, the 9th Air Force alone used over 25 million gallons of aviation fuel each month, all transported across the Atlantic in mass-produced tankers. Even more significant than production was pilot training. By 1944, the United States was graduating around 30,000 pilots annually, more than Germany had trained during the entire war. Each P-47 pilot typically logged at least 400 hours of flight time before entering combat, including extensive experience in advanced fighters. In contrast, German pilots late in the war often entered combat with fewer than 100 total flight hours. The difference was evident in performance. American pilots arrived in Europe well-trained in formation flying, navigation, gunnery, and tactics. They had studied captured enemy aircraft and understood their opponent's strengths and weaknesses. Lieutenant Eugene Roberts, who arrived in England in September 1944, reflected this advantage. "I had 420 hours in my logbook, including 75 in the P-47. I had practiced on towed targets, worked on deflection shooting, and studied gun camera footage from real combat," one American pilot recalled. "By my first mission, I already knew what to do. The German pilot I faced didn't have half my experience. It wasn't an even fight." In March 1945, Joseph Priller, the same pilot who had mocked the P-47 2 years earlier, was interviewed by German propaganda officials. His remarks were never published, considered too damaging to morale, but they revealed just how much perceptions had changed. The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is unmatched. Guns that don't jam, don't overheat, and don't run dry in normal combat. It carries bombs like a medium bomber, fires rockets like artillery, and still fights like a true fighter when needed. But beyond the aircraft itself is what it represents. Unlimited American production. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose one. It's gone for good. Their pilots arrive better trained than our instructors. They have fuel for training, ammunition for practice, spare parts for everything. We have only courage. And courage without resources is simply delayed defeat. We laughed at them in 1943. We're not laughing anymore. When you hear those guns, you know death is coming. That sound stays with you. Mechanical, precise, unstoppable. Like everything American, it reflects overwhelming material superiority. They didn't defeat us with better tactics or greater bravery. They buried us under steel and fire. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe existed largely on paper. Fuel shortages kept most aircraft grounded, experienced pilots were gone, and airfields had been reduced to craters. Even if planes and fuel had been available, German pilots faced an impossible situation. Any attack meant confronting P-47 formations that controlled every altitude from ground level to 40,000 feet. Feldwebel Klaus Bretschneider, one of the last German pilots trained in 1945, flew just a single combat mission before the war ended. His encounter with P-47s over Leipzig lasted only seconds. I saw them diving from above, 4 Thunderbolts in perfect formation. I tried to turn, but they were already too fast. The leader opened fire from 500 meters. My aircraft shook like it was being smashed by hammers. The engine exploded, the wing tore away. I barely escaped. From my parachute, I watched them destroy the rest of my squadron. 6 fighters gone in less than a minute. The sky was filled with burning wreckage and falling debris. The psychological toll was devastating. German pilots began suffering what medical officers called Jabo fever. Stress reactions triggered simply by reports of incoming fighter bombers. Veterans who had once faced Spitfires and Hurricanes without hesitation now experienced physical fear before missions involving P-47s. On the ground, troops learned to recognize the deep rumble of approaching Thunderbolts, an unmistakable warning to take cover immediately. The final statistics of P-47 operations were staggering. In Europe alone, they destroyed 3,752 German aircraft in the air and 3,315 on the ground, along with 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armored vehicles, 68,000 trucks, and 60,000 horse-drawn transports. In the Pacific, Thunderbolts accounted for 697 Japanese aircraft destroyed in the air and 150 on the ground, along with thousands of vehicles, locomotives, ships, and installations. The 9th Air Force, largely equipped with P-47s, flew 213,873 combat sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million rounds of ammunition, and launched 60,000 rockets. Thunderbolt units achieved a 4.61 kill ratio while maintaining one of the lowest loss rates among Allied fighter bombers. Behind these immense figures was a heavy human cost. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots in combat against Western Allied forces, a loss it could never recover from. Many German pilots fell victim to the concentrated fire of American heavy machine guns. Each loss represented years of training, time and experience Germany could no longer afford to replace. By the end of the war, the average German fighter pilot had fewer than 30 hours of combat experience, while the average P-47 pilot had logged over 200. At the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center in Oberursel, captured Allied pilots were questioned and analyzed by German intelligence. Documents recovered in 1945 revealed how dramatically German assessments of the P-47 had evolved over time. April 1943. Large, heavy, and not very maneuverable. Inferior to German fighters in most areas except diving speed. Machine gun armament considered inadequate against cannon-armed opponents. Assessment: minimal threat. December 1943. Outstanding high-altitude performance. Exceptional structural durability. Firepower becoming a growing concern. Pilot tactics improving. Assessment: serious threat above 25,000 feet. June 1944. Dominant fighter bomber. Superior to German aircraft at higher altitudes. Devastating firepower against both air and ground targets. Extremely difficult to destroy due to rugged construction. Assessment: critical threat at all altitudes. March 1945. Arguably the best fighter bomber of the war. Unmatched combination of firepower, durability, and performance. Allied pilot training highly effective. Assessment: nearly impossible to defeat in direct combat. In 1985, during a reunion of former German and American pilots in Phoenix, Arizona, old enemies met again. This time in peace. Adolf Galland, former commander of Germany's fighter forces, was asked about the P-47. His response captured the complete reversal in perception. We made a serious mistake in 1943. We saw this large, heavy fighter and laughed. We thought the Americans didn't understand air combat, that they had built a bomber and called it a fighter. But we were the ones who didn't understand. The Americans didn't try to copy European designs. They built an aircraft based on their own strengths: production, firepower, and survivability. They understood that in a war of attrition, the aircraft that could endure damage and deliver overwhelming firepower would prevail. And they were right. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, everything became clear. The power was extraordinary. It climbed with incredible force. The cockpit was comfortable, visibility was excellent, and the controls were precise. It was a pilot's aircraft, protected by armor. But what impressed me most was this. The United States built over 15,000 of these highly complex machines while fighting a war on 2 oceans. Each one had an engine more advanced than anything we produced. Yet they manufactured them faster than we could build much simpler fighters. That's when I realized we never really had a chance, one German veteran later admitted. Those guns. We called them Roosevelt's piano because of the sound. Once you heard it, you never forgot it. For many of my friends, it was the last thing they ever heard. The P-47 didn't just challenge the Luftwaffe, it played a major role in breaking it. Its design perfectly reflected American industrial philosophy. Brute force engineering supported by vast resources. Nearly every component was built with strength and redundancy in mind. The wing structure, for example, could tumble loads of up to 40,000 pounds, around 3 times the aircraft's fully loaded weight. The engine mount was designed to endure forces up to 12 G. Control systems were duplicated, with backup mechanisms built in to ensure functionality even after damage. Its armament system was equally advanced. 8 separate ammunition boxes, each holding 425 rounds, fed into the guns through electrically assisted mechanisms to prevent jamming during high-G maneuvers. The guns themselves were electrically heated to avoid freezing at high altitude. Each had an independent charging system and could be synchronized individually. Pilots could even adjust the convergence of fire, from about 150 to 400 yards, depending on their preferred combat style. Even after the war, some German veterans argued that the P-47's success came down to numbers rather than quality, that their own fighters were technically superior but overwhelmed. However, combat records suggest a more complex reality. In engagements where numbers were roughly equal, P-47s often held the advantage. The heavy machine gun armament, initially dismissed as inferior to cannons, proved highly effective in practice. Gun camera analysis showed why. While cannon shells delivered greater individual impact, they required precise aim and came with limited ammunition, usually between 120 and 200 rounds. By contrast, the P-47's 8.50 caliber guns created a dense stream of fire, increasing the likelihood of hits even with less than perfect accuracy. In a typical engagement, a 2-second burst could land dozens of rounds on a fighter-sized target, more than enough to destroy it. The ammunition itself also played a role. American armor-piercing incendiary rounds were designed to penetrate before igniting, burning at temperatures around 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to set aircraft structures ablaze. German 20 mm shells, though more powerful per hit, often detonated on impact, sometimes causing dramatic but less structurally damaging explosions. The P-47 Thunderbolt remains the heaviest single-engine piston fighter ever mass-produced. Its empty weight of roughly 10,000 pounds exceeded the fully loaded weight of some twin-engine fighters from earlier eras. Its engine generated more power than entire bomber formations from World War I, and its weaponry delivered firepower comparable to that of a small infantry unit. Yet despite its complexity, it was produced in massive numbers, flown by very young pilots, and maintained under demanding combat conditions by mechanics who often learned their skills in a matter of weeks. The transformation in German perception, from ridicule to fear, took less than 2 years. In that short time, the flying milk bottle became one of the most feared aircraft the Luftwaffe had ever faced. Veterans who had once fought Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Soviet Yaks without hesitation would later speak of the P-47 in quiet, almost reverent tones decades after the war. At the National Museum of the United States Air Force, a restored P-47D stands among other legendary fighters. Its plaque lists specifications and combat achievements, but the deeper story is told by a small display nearby. Spent .50 caliber shell casings and a strip of gun camera film capturing a Focke-Wulf 190 breaking apart under sustained fire. Beneath it is a quote from an anonymous German pilot recorded during a 1945 interrogation. "We laughed when we first saw them. Big, awkward American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to. They only had to aim those guns at you, and you ceased to exist. The laughter died with our comrades." The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war as an object of mockery and ended it as a symbol of overwhelming force. Between those moments, its 8 synchronized Browning machine guns reshaped aerial combat and helped crush German air power under relentless fire. German pilots may have laughed in April 1943, but by May 1945 there was no one left to laugh. The Thunderbolt had made its mark, and the skies were no longer contested.